Before we get to my title, which is a bit of a mouthful, we need to make one thing clear and hopefully agree on it, that deer are a problem. We three were introduced as talking about pests, and from an agricultural point of view and from a habitat management point of view, deer are certainly pests. The picture behind me is of a deer exclosure in Denmark. So on your right, you've got an area that deer are are excluded from, and on your left, where they're allowed to graze freely. And straight away, you can see the difference there with trees regenerating in one area and not another. To put that in perspective and put some figures on it, in the UK, due to deer damage, 4.3 million annual losses to cereal crops, a devaluation of timber crops of anywhere in the region of 30 to 50%. I realise that's a big margin for error, but 40 to 74,000 deer-related car crashes, 700 plus injuries, 10 to 20 human fatalities each year on the roads due to deer collisions, resulting in somewhere in the region of £17 million worth of damage to vehicles. On top of that, from a habitat point of view, 4% of sites of special scientific interest are in an unfavourable condition due to deer impacts, with another 4% recovering after deer management plans or plans have been put in place to deal with those deer, which is equivalent to about 840 square miles of habitat in a bad condition, specifically due to deer impacts. So deer are a problem, which leads me to my mouthful of a title. I wanted to look at how we could deal with deer management issues on a landscape scale, outside of just individual land holdings, and how we could deal with some of these impacts on habitats, rural enterprises, and potentially also how we could deal with producing sustainable venison in the UK. So many of you will be familiar with this sort of patchwork landscape, possibly not quite as flat as this part of the Cambridgeshire Fens where you farm, but you will be familiar with this patchwork of woodland habitats, fields, ditches, etc. And it was a bit of research I put together. This is a piece of land where I manage the deer, not only on the arable land, but on the woodland nature reserves that are found amongst this arable landscape. Now, if you're going to manage the deer within those woodlands, it's more or less impossible if you're only working in the woodland. Between 2008 and 2015, only 7.5% of the cull of deer that were impacting the woodland was taken within the woodland itself, leaving us with the bulk of the work to do on the adjacent farmland. Now, if we didn't have access to that, that would have been an issue. We wouldn't have been able to do anything to help the woodland recover from the damage done by deer. Just to bring it right up to date, that has now increased with sort of carefully sited high seats and various other things to 10.2%, but still a drop in the ocean in terms of trying to protect those woodlands from the impacts of deer. And then if you consider the woodland and then think of the farm as a whole, those several thousand acres, you would be in the same position trying to manage impacts on that farm if that farm was taken in the context of the county in which it's in or the country in which it's in. So we need to look at this management, wildlife management specifically for my study in terms of deer, but we need to look at it on a larger scale. So I went to some bigger landscapes. This is McInnes Canyon in Colorado. That's the Colorado River down there. I felt like I was in a Western while I was traveling around there. This is Mudus National Park in Sweden. Video recreation area in Wyoming, the United States. What we're looking at is it's still land on which there is wildlife to be managed, but it's the scale of the management that is different than what I was hoping to learn from. This is Flaming Gorge in the Ashley National Forest in Utah. Now, managing not just in little pockets on individual land holdings was the key. And a professor I met at Brigham Young University said this is Professor Brock McMillan. He said there's no biological basis for wildlife to be managed within man-made boundaries. The deer don't care whose land they're on. They could be on mine, they could be on yours. They're going to eat whatever they want to eat, regardless of who put a fence in the way and whose name is on the deed that makes that land theirs. Deer couldn't care less. There is a slight caveat to that in that effective physical boundaries do make a difference, whether that's fences, or large transport infrastructure, major roads, for example, can hinder deer and other wildlife in crossing and form an effective barrier. This just happens to be an exclusion fence on the Isle of Arran on Glen Rosa, where there's a 32-hectare reforesting project in Glen Rosa that they're trying to fence the deer out of. So effective physical boundaries can sort of be a caveat to that, but generally there's no biological basis to just manage wildlife on individual land holdings. On the topic of fencing, though, as we're touching on it, there a bit of research that I tapped into in Sweden, and something that you will see if you travel up any of the major roads in Sweden in particular, you'll see big sort of deer height fences up and down either side of the road. And the idea is to stop elk crossing the road and causing road traffic accidents. And they have been, in a study in southern Sweden, they were proven to be 60 to 80% effective in reducing the number of times elk were crossing the road. Now, just a point of clarification, because we tend to use Americanized English nowadays. When I say elk, it's that. Yeah, moose is what it would be called in the USA. I'm reliably informed that it's elk in Welsh as well, although spelt with a C instead of a K. As I'm a teacher by training, I'll test you later. We'll come back to that. But what occurred to me was, could fenced roads targeted in high priority areas, so areas of the country where we have a particularly large number of road traffic accidents related to deer, places like the Ashdown Forest, the New Forest, places like that, could roadside fencing help reduce this? And if we were going to put some up anyway to reduce RTCs, would that give us some boundaries within which we could sort of break up deer populations and manage within those boundaries? Might that be something that would be worth trying? One of the other things that became clear in speaking to people in the States is that what we lack comparatively to what they have in the States is data. Individual land managers, deer managers, might have a good idea of the numbers of deer they have or the number that they need to cull. I'm quite pleased with the data I have on the land that I manage. It allowed me to sort of drill into it a bit and work out how many deer we were culling in certain areas and was it being effective. But that sort of data is reliant on the Mark I eyeball most of the time. It is what you observe, and you only get that if you're out on the land a lot. What we don't have is some of the data that can be derived from technology, and what they're doing, particularly in Utah, where I was speaking to their state wildlife departments and some of the professors from the university that are involved in the research, is they radio tag a lot of deer. So they've got thousands and thousands of animals on which they can get real-time data of what habitats they're using, where they're migrating to, and where they're being a problem. We don't really have that in the UK, but it could be really useful in advising and determining what cull plans should be put in place and implemented to try and deal with the issues, whether there's higher impacts on cereal crops or forestry or different regions, what's going on and how we can then create an effective plan. So data is something that's a bit of a missing puzzle piece for us at the moment, something we perhaps need to work on. Getting onto that sustainable venison thing. Venison is delicious. So it does have, even though we need less of them in certain areas to mitigate some of these impacts, there is a byproduct, a premium product of venison. They don't often come into supermarkets quite so willingly as this one, but there is a market for them. And it's worth mentioning, this is a reindeer. The reindeer production, sort of meat production industry in Sweden is quite an interesting thing. It's all run by the Sami people of Lapland. They traditionally own and herd reindeer. And it did get me thinking, looking at some of the ways that those herds are managed, as to whether there would be an application to some of our herding deer species, such as red and fallow perhaps. Could they, to assist with culling, could we use corrals similarly to what they use in Scandinavia, which you can see behind me here, where they corral the reindeer in there. Now, those reindeer have got hundreds and hundreds of years of habit, which and are used to being herded, I think if you tried it on a red deer, it might surprise it a bit. But is it something that we could consider? In terms of the venison, though, we still import venison to the UK. 900 tonnes, equivalent to 17,000 deer carcasses, were imported in 2015 from New Zealand. And there is projected growth in the demand for venison. Now, that's a 2019 figure. COVID and the sort of impact on the restaurant trade has impacted that, but the projection was 10 to 11% growth in the demand for venison each year in the UK. So there's a demand for it. But the solution to whether that's to putting the venison on your table or reducing the impacts of deer isn't just to shoot more deer. And the reality of it is that is how wild deer are taken out of the habitats that they're damaging or are making it onto your plates in a restaurant or wherever you happen to be eating it. It has to be the right deer. So we have a lot of good stuff in place already in the UK. We've got the demand for it. There is research and evidence demanding the management of deer. There is demand for venison as a product. We have the labour. There are deer stalkers. There are professional and amateur deer managers out there that are doing a significant work. The caveat I put on that, which is probably the same for any land-based job at all, is that it is an ageing labour force, and we probably need to spend a bit of time encouraging new and younger people to get involved with it. We have appropriate legislation. We have the easiest legislation in the world for getting wild venison into the human food chain. There's nowhere else in the world that it's as easy to put it on someone's table as it is in the UK. And we generally have support for more and increased deer management. A lot of the publications demanding deer management or the reduction of deer impacts is published by the RSPB. There is a demand, or at least not huge opposition to more deer management taking place. But what we don't have in our little puzzle here is data. We don't have enough data to inform, and we don't have the cooperative landscape scale objectives that can be influenced by that data. And that's what we need to get to. But just want to thank, there's too many people really to thank, but particularly the John Oldacre Foundation for their sponsorship, my wife and children for tolerating my absences and encouraging me. And I should really mention as well that my lifelong interest in deer was prompted not only by my own father, but by this book written by a Welshman. It's made a great difference to me, so thank you all very much.